There is a city that has burned to the ground and been rebuilt. There is a city that has been emptied of its entire population and then refilled by different people speaking a different language, who built their homes on top of the silence the first people left behind. There is a city that has been struck by plague and fire and aerial bombardment, and each time, without exception, has responded not by retreating but by expanding, not by simplifying but by becoming more complicated, more layered, more itself. The city is London, though that name has meant different things to different people across 2,000 years of more or less continuous habitation. And the question worth sitting with tonight, worth following through the dark and the long centuries, is not how London survived all of that, but why a place keeps choosing, again and again, to become the thing it is. Before we go further, if this is the kind of company you come here for at night, subscribing to the channel means the next story will find you when it is ready. There is always another city, another century, another long and layered thing worth knowing in the dark. Now let us begin. It is before dawn on the north bank of the Thames, and the river is doing what the Thames has always done at this hour, which is to move through the city as though the city is not quite there, dark and tidal and indifferent to everything built along its edges. The smell is mud and cold water and something older beneath both of those things. The particular mineral smell of a riverbank that has been a riverbank for a very long time, that was a riverbank before anyone decided to call it anything. Somewhere to the east, the sky is beginning to separate itself from the water, just barely. The way a thought arrives before you know what it is. There is a low mist on the water, barely visible but present in the way that things are present in the dark, felt rather than seen. The tide is at its lowest now, the foreshore exposed, and in the mud along the bank there are things that should not be there and yet are. A fragment of pottery, worn smooth by the current and the centuries, a tile stamped with the mark of a Roman workshop, a coin that has been turning in the river since before any of the buildings on either bank were imagined. The Thames gives up its old things when the tide drops low enough. And at this hour, when nobody is watching, it does so quietly, without ceremony, the way a very old person lets slip a name they have been carrying alone for a long time. Across the water, the shapes of buildings are beginning to resolve out of the dark. The dome of a cathedral, the sharp silhouette of a glass tower, a bridge with its lights still on, even though there is no traffic yet. They look, in this light, like things from different worlds set down next to each other without ceremony. And in a way they are, 2,000 years of successive cities occupying the same ground, each one building on and over and sometimes straight through the one that came before. Whatever this place is, it did not start as a city. It started as a decision about where to put a bridge. The river knows this. The river was here before the decision and will be here after the last bridge is gone. Stand on the bank and you can feel it, the water moving at your feet in the dark, the same tidal pull that first made this particular bend in this particular river the place where a great city would eventually stand, and stand, and stand, and stand. The question the river poses, if you listen to it long enough, is not about any specific empire or plague or fire. It is about the nature of places and why certain places call people back, generation after generation, even after everything has been destroyed, and the reasons for coming here should, by any rational calculation, have long since dissolved into history. London has been destroyed several times. Each time, someone looked at the rubble and the silence and the unchanged river and decided to try again. This story is about what kind of place does that, and what kind of people, and what it might tell us about the strange persistence of cities in the life of the human animal. Start here, then, before the Romans. Before the bridge, before the name, the Thames has been cutting its course through the landscape of what would become southeastern England for longer than any human settlement has existed anywhere in Europe. By the time the first people arrived in the river valley in any permanent sense, walking in from the land bridge that connected Britain to the continent before the seas rose, the river had already established its basic character: wide, tidal in its lower reach, crossable at certain points where the gravel of the riverbed came close enough to the surface to make a ford or support a structure. The river did not choose the city. The river created the conditions that made the city inevitable, and then the city arrived. The crossing point that would eventually become London was not the only possible crossing of the lower Thames, but it was the best one for a long distance in either direction, a place where two gravel terraces rose on the north and south banks above the tidal mud, firm enough to build on and high enough to stay dry, and where the river narrowed just enough to make a bridge possible without requiring a feat of engineering beyond the technology of the moment. The Iron Age communities who moved through this landscape were aware of the crossing, and there is evidence, tentative and incomplete as archaeological evidence of this period usually is, of ritual activity in and around the river at the point where the city would later stand, weapons and precious objects thrown into the water at a significant crossing. This is how people mark a place as important before they have the means to build on it permanently. When the Roman legions arrived in force in 43 CE, sent by the Emperor Claudius to extend his empire to the edge of the known world, they came with a practical intelligence about rivers and roads that the communities already living in Britain found both useful and impossible to resist. The Romans needed to move armies quickly, and armies move on roads, and roads need to cross rivers, and crossing rivers efficiently requires bridges. The gravel terrace above the tidal mud of the north bank of the Thames, with its correspondingly stable bank on the south side, was the obvious place for the first permanent bridge in Britain, and so the decision was made. Here, at this bend, at this crossing, a city would grow. Londinium was not planned in the way that modern cities are planned, with master architects and comprehensive visions and long consultations. It grew the way all ancient cities grow, which is to say it grew from the logic of its position. The bridge came first, because the bridge was the reason for being here, and then the road on either side of the bridge, and then the houses and workshops that served the people who used the road, and then the warehouses and wharfs along the bank that served the merchants who came by river, and within a generation of the first stakes being driven into the gravel terrace, Londinium was a city of tens of thousands of people. A dense and noisy and multilingual place, where Latin was the language of administration, but where you could hear Gaulish and British and Greek and languages of North Africa in the same afternoon, depending on which street you walked down and which merchant you stopped to deal with. The physical scale of what the Romans built here is still legible in the city, though you have to know how to look for it. The form, the administrative and commercial heart of Londinium, was the largest building complex north of the Alps outside of Rome itself at its height. A vast covered market and public space that occupied the ground where several modern streets now run in the area around what is now called Gracechurch Street. The basilica attached to the forum was longer than the nave of the medieval St. Squint, Paul's Cathedral that would eventually be built half a mile to the west. A hall of justice and civic assembly on a scale designed to impress upon everyone who entered it the weight and permanence of Roman power. The walls, built in the late 2nd century CE, when Londinium had grown large enough and important enough to require formal fortification, were 3 to 4 meters thick at their base and enclosed an area of roughly 130 hectares, a footprint that is still visible today in the curve of certain streets and the placement of certain gates that have given their names to districts of a modern city. What the physical record cannot fully convey is the human texture of the place. the daily life of a city that was simultaneously a frontier outpost and a provincial capital and a major node in the trading networks that connected the northern edge of the Roman world to its Mediterranean heart. The evidence for that life is fragmentary and touching in the way that all fragmentary evidence is touching, precisely because it comes from ordinary moments rather than grand ones. The handwritten wooden tablets found on building sites in the modern city, preserved by the anaerobic mud of the old river foreshore, are the earliest written documents ever discovered in Britain, and many of them are entirely mundane: a note about the delivery of goods, a request for repayment of a debt, the record of a financial transaction between people whose names we can read but whose faces we can only imagine. There is something quietly extraordinary about holding in the mind's eye a letter written in Roman Britain, scratched in ink on a thin wooden tablet, complaining about a shipment of nails. The city was not always peaceful. Roughly 17 years after its founding, Londinium was destroyed almost completely, burned to the ground in the revolt led by Boudicca, queen of the Iceni tribe, whose rebellion against Roman rule swept through the southeast of Britain in a campaign of devastating violence. The archaeological layer from this destruction is visible still in excavations beneath the modern city, a stratum of burnt red material several centimeters thick that appears at the right depth in sites across the area of the Roman settlement, the physical record of a city consumed by fire in a single event. The Romans rebuilt, as Romans did, and rebuilt larger and more ambitiously than before. And Londinium became, after its burning, not less important but more so, the administrative capital of the province of Britannia and the largest city in the northwest of the empire. What comes next is one of the stranger facts of London's long history, and one that is worth sitting with. The Roman city did not fall in a single dramatic catastrophe. It did not burn again or get conquered or get washed away. It simply, gradually emptied, as Roman authority in Britain weakened across the 4th century, as the legions were withdrawn to shore up more threatened parts of the empire, as the administrative and commercial infrastructure that had sustained a city of tens of thousands began to lose its funding and its purpose. People left, not all at once, not in a single exodus, but in the way that cities empty when the reason for being there starts to fade, household by workshop, until the Forum stood silent and the great basilica began to lose its roof, and the streets that had been busy with the noise of a multilingual trading city held only the wind and the grass growing between the paving stones. By the early 5th century, the walled Roman city was, to all intents and purposes, empty. The walls were still standing. The road grid was still legible. The bridge, or its remains, was still spanning the river. But the people were gone, or most of them were, and what remained was something that has no good modern equivalent: a city-sized absence. A place where a great deal of human effort had been concentrated over 3 centuries and then simply withdrawn, leaving its bones in the ground for whoever came next. This is the first thing to understand about London, and it is the thing that the rest of the story will keep returning to in different forms. The Roman city did not survive as a living place. It survived as a set of conditions: walls that still enclosed a defined space, roads that still enclosed a defined space, roads that still led to a crossing point, a river that was still worth crossing. The people who came next would not think of themselves as restoring what Rome had built. They would think of themselves as starting fresh in a new place with new purposes. And yet the bones of the old city would shape everything they did, quietly and inevitably, the way the geology of a landscape shapes the choices of the people who live on it, without those people ever having to consciously decide to follow its contours. The silence inside the Roman walls was not an ending. It was an interval, patient and full of latent possibility, waiting for the next beginning. A Roman surveyor standing at the edge of a gravel terrace above the tidal mud of the Thames, driving a stake into the ground, is not a dramatic image in any conventional sense, and yet it is the image from which everything else in this story grows, because the decision that man made, or the decision his team made collectively, or the decision that was handed down to them by the administrative machinery of an empire that had been making exactly this kind of decision across a vast arc of the known world for several generations, was the decision that created London. Not London as a city with a name and a character and a 2,000-year history. London as a place at all. London as a point on a map, a crossing on a river. A reason for people to gather at this specific bend of this specific stretch of water, rather than any of the other bends and stretches of water, the landscape of what would eventually be called Britain. The stake goes in, the decision is made. Everything that follows from that, it was 43 CE, or close enough to that date, that the exact year does not much matter, and the legions of the Emperor Claudius had been in Britain for less than a year, having crossed the Channel in a force large enough to overwhelm the British tribal confederations that met them in the field, and having marched inland with the efficiency of an army that had done this many times in many pla. Caesar knew exactly how an invasion turned into an occupation, turned into a province. The bridge was the first thing, because without a reliable crossing of the Thames, nothing else worked. Not the roads that would connect London to the rest of the province, not the supply lines that would sustain a garrison, not the commercial networks that would eventually make the city rich. The gravel terrace was the reason this particular spot was chosen. Firm ground above the tidal mud on both banks, with a narrowing of the river that made a bridge both possible and not absurdly long, and the decision to put the crossing here rather than somewhere else upstream or downstream was as consequential a piece of engineering judgment as any made in the subsequent 2,000 years of London's existence. What rose from that decision, and rose with a speed that even the Romans seem to have found remarkable, was a city of a kind that the landscape of Britain had not seen before. The communities that had lived along the Thames before Rome arrived had their own settlements, their own patterns of trade and agriculture and seasonal movement, but nothing like what Londinium became within a single generation of the legion's landing, a dense urban settlement of tens of thousands of people, with a port that handled goods arriving from across the empire, a forum that served as the commercial and administrative heart of a province. A basilica attached to that forum that was the largest building north of the Alps outside of Rome itself, warehouses and workshops and private houses and public baths and the full range of civic infrastructure that Rome regarded as the basic equipment of a properly functioning city. The speed of this growth was not accidental. Rome was building a city here with intent, imposing urban form on a landscape that had not previously required it, because a province needed a capital, and a capital needed a city, and a city needed to be built, and Rome knew how to build cities with an efficiency that bordered on the industrial. The people who built Londinium and who lived in it were not, for the most part, the kind of people whose names survive in historical records. The governors and the senior military commanders and the occasional emperor passing through have left their traces in inscriptions and administrative documents, but the real population of Londinium, the merchants and craftsmen and laborers and traders and slaves who made the city function on a daily basis, is mostly known through archaeology rather than through written testimony, which means through things rather than words. The pottery that came from workshops in what is now France, the glass that came from the eastern Mediterranean, the grain that came from farms in the south of Britain, the copper alloy that came from mines in Wales, the evidence of olive oil and wine in storage jars that originated in Spain and North Africa. Londinium was a city of trade, and the goods that passed through it arrived from and departed to places that a resident of the city's hinterland could not have named and might not have been able to imagine, which is itself a remarkable fact about a settlement that had not existed 50 years earlier. The wooden writing tablets that have been found in the mud beneath the modern city give some of these invisible people their voices, briefly and imperfectly. The tablets are thin, about the size of a small paperback book, and they were written on in ink and then discarded, and some of them ended up in the anaerobic conditions of the old waterfront deposits where organic material can survive for extraordinary lengths of time. And some of those have been excavated and read by scholars who can still decipher the faint traces of handwriting that have survived 2,000 years in the mud. The messages are almost entirely mundane. Someone is owed money and wants it repaid. A shipment of goods has arrived and its contents need to be recorded. A name is written at the top of a document as a formal witness. There is, in one extraordinary tablet, what appears to be a record of a legal transaction involving property, with the names of the parties and the witnesses preserved across 2 millennia in the looping cursive script of a Roman Londoner who had no idea that anyone would ever read what he had written and would have found the thought incomprehensible. Let the tablets rest here for a moment. Let the mud hold them. The city above them is going about its morning business. The market stalls opening at the Forum. The sounds of iron on iron from the metalworking shops near the river. The smell of the tanneries that seem to have operated just outside the main settlement, in a location that suggests even the Romans understood the social dimensions of certain industrial processes. Someone is walking across the bridge with a cart. Someone is unloading amphorae at the wharf. Someone is writing a note about nails. The Thames is moving through the city in the way it always moves, tidal and patient and entirely unconcerned with the human project on its banks. The first catastrophe in London's long history of catastrophes came not from a foreign power, but from an uprising within the province. Boudicca was the queen of the Iceni, a tribe whose territory lay in what is now Norfolk and Suffolk, and her revolt against Roman rule in approximately 61 CE had its origins in the specific brutalities of Roman provincial administration, the seizure of her tribe's lands following the death of her husband, the physical humiliation of Boudicca herself, the plundering of Iceni aristocrats by Arasild. Oman financiers who had extended them loans and now called them in with violent efficiency. The revolt spread quickly, and by the time it reached Londinium, the city was not defended in any meaningful way, the Roman governor Gaius Suetonius Paulinus having taken his legions north to deal with a religious center on the island of Mona, calculating, incorrectly as it turned out, that a southern uprising could be managed or delayed. The governor sent word that he could not return in time, and the people of Londinium made the choice that was available to them, which was to leave or to stay, and many of them left, and many of them did not, and the ones who did not were killed when the army of the Iceni arrived. Londinium was evacuated in part, but the city itself was left to Boudicca's forces, who burned it to the ground in a fire that the archaeology still records 4 meters below the streets of the modern city. The archaeological evidence for this event is still visible in excavations beneath the modern city, a layer of burnt red material a few centimeters thick that appears at precisely the right depth across the area of the Roman settlement, the physical record of a destruction that happened in a single event and left its mark in the geology of the place as clearly as any natural catastrophe. The Romans rebuilt, as they always rebuilt, and they rebuilt with an emphasis on permanence that suggests the province's administrators were determined to demonstrate that the uprising had not interrupted the fundamental project of Roman Britain. The new Londinium was larger and more formally organized than the one that had burned. The Forum expanded to its full size, the basilica constructed at a scale that made it unambiguously the dominant building in the province. The walls begun in the late 2nd century to enclose the settlement within a formal boundary that defined London for the next 1500 years. The walls deserve particular attention because they are the longest-lasting physical thing the Romans did in London. The infrastructure, whose traces are still most clearly legible in the modern city. They were built of Kentish ragstone hauled up the river by barge, roughly 3 to 4 meters thick at the base and originally 4 to 6 meters high, with towers at intervals and gates at the points where the main roads entered and left the city. The gates gave their names to districts of the modern city: Aldgate, Bishopsgate, Newgate, Ludgate, names still in daily use by people who have no particular reason to know that they are using words that refer to specific openings in a wall built in the 2nd century by an administration that no longer exists in a country that was not yet England. The walls enclosed roughly 130 hectares, an area that remained the formal boundary of the City of London for most of its subsequent history. The square mile that is still identified as a distinct administrative entity within the modern metropolis. What Londinium was at its height, roughly between the late 1st century and the middle of the 3rd, was a genuinely cosmopolitan city, a place where the movement of people and goods across the empire produced a population of extraordinary diversity by the standards of the ancient world. The evidence for this comes from various sources. Inscriptions that record the origins and occupations of specific individuals, physical remains from burials that tell stories of movement and mixed ancestry, the material culture of the city that shows connections in all directions simultaneously. There were people in Roman London whose origins lay in what is now Germany, Syria, Spain, North Africa, and the various provinces of the empire's northern and eastern reaches. And this diversity was not incidental to what the city was but essential to it, because Londinium's importance derived precisely from its position as a node in a network that extended far beyond Britain, a place where goods and people and information converged from multiple directions and were redistributed in new configurations. The city had a governor's palace, substantial enough to have required serious archaeological effort to map its full extent. It had a fort garrisoned by soldiers whose specific unit affiliations changed across the centuries of Roman occupation. It had an amphitheatre, the outline of which is preserved in the curve of a modern street in the area around what is now Guildhall, where the medieval civic administration of London would later establish itself on ground that had been the site of public entertainment for the Roman city. There is something pleasingly continuous about this, the place where Roman Londoners gathered for public events becoming the place where medieval Londoners gathered for civic business, and the place where modern Londoners gather for civic business, all of them separated by centuries of entirely different ways of organizing themselves, and all of them drawn to the same piece of ground by a logic: fire. T is too deep and too various to be called planning. Give yourself a moment here to feel the weight of what has just been described. A city that did not exist. Then a city of tens of thousands. Then a city burned to ash. Then a city rebuilt larger than before. Then a city with walls and a governor and a palace and an amphitheatre and a port that connected it to the Mediterranean world. All of this in the space of roughly 300 years, on a piece of ground where none of it had been before. The speed is almost incomprehensible until you remember that humans have always been capable of this kind of concentrated effort when the conditions are right, when there is a reason to build and the resources to do so and the institutional will to direct both toward a specific end. The conditions began to change in the late 3rd century as the administrative and military pressures on the Roman Empire accumulated at a rate that eventually outpaced its capacity to manage them. Britain was relatively peripheral to the greatest crises of the late Empire, but it was not untouched by them, and the effects showed in Londinium in the form of a city that seems to have been gradually losing population and economic activity across the 4th century, not collapsing suddenly, but contracting slowly. The commercial life of the port diminishing. The grand civic buildings beginning to require maintenance that was not always forthcoming. The process is difficult to date precisely, which is itself a kind of historical evidence. The end of Roman London was not a dramatic event that anyone recorded because it needed to be recorded, but a gradual fading of the conditions that had made the city possible, a withdrawal of purpose and investment, and people that left the physical infrastructure standing, but increasingly unused. The last Roman coin from a secure context in Londinium dates to around 410 CE, which is also approximately the date at which the Emperor Honorius is said to have informed the cities of Britain that they should look to their own defense, the empire no longer being in a position to provide the legions that had maintained order and security in the province for nearly 4 centuries. Whether this statement was actually made in the specific form that later sources describe it is one of those historical questions that cannot be answered with certainty. But the date itself is meaningful. By the early 5th century, the administrative, military, and economic infrastructure that had sustained Roman London had been withdrawn or had collapsed, and the city was becoming something that it had never been before, which is to say, a place without a clear purpose. A settlement without a reason to be settled. And so the walled city stood, and the wind moved through the forum in the way that wind moves through any large enclosed space when there is no longer anyone to notice it, and the grass grew between the paving stones in the slow way that vegetation reclaims any surface when the human effort required to prevent it is no longer applied. The basilica lost its roof to the weather and to the gradual removal of usable materials by people who needed building stone and found plenty of it available in the ruins of a very large building. The warehouses along the waterfront went the same way. The bath buildings, which required constant maintenance and the heating infrastructure of a complex hydraulic system, were among the first major structures to fall out of use. The river continued to move through the landscape in the way it had always moved, tidal and patient and entirely unchanged by the human events on its banks, which had been going on for 3 centuries now, and were, apparently, not going to go on for much longer, at least not in the same form. What remained in the empty city is a question that archaeology has not entirely answered, because the absence of evidence is not the same as the evidence of absence, and small groups of people living in reduced circumstances in the corner of a large ruined city would leave very different traces from a thriving urban population. There may have been a residual community of some kind within the walls for longer than the formal withdrawal of Roman administration suggests. There were certainly people in the surrounding landscape, British communities who had lived alongside and within the Roman city, and who continued to live in the Thames Valley after its institutional structures had collapsed, farming the land and using the river in ways that had not changed fundamentally since before the Romans arrived. But Londinium, as a functioning city, as a place of commerce and administration and dense urban habitation, was gone. The walls remained. The road network that converged on the city remained, faded but legible in the landscape. The river remained. The bridge had probably fallen into disrepair and eventually into the river, but the crossing point was still the crossing point, still the place where the gravel terraces on both banks rose above the tidal mud and made passage possible. All of this remained, patient and present in the landscape, waiting for the next people who would need it. The silence inside the walls was not the silence of a place that had been erased. It was the silence of a place that had been put down, carefully and almost entirely intact, by people who had no idea they were doing any such thing and who were simply, gradually, going elsewhere, following the logic of their circumstances the way people have always followed the logic of their circumstances, without being able to see that the place they were leaving would one day matter again. What the empty Roman city was, in the centuries of its silence, was a question that the landscape was posing to whoever came next, whenever they came, whatever they brought with them. The question was not about Rome. Rome was finished, or finished enough that no one living in the Thames Valley in the 5th century had any reason to think of restoring it. The question was simpler and more persistent than that. The same question that this entire story will keep returning to in different forms. What do you do with a place that is still there, still bounded by its walls, and drained by its river and crossed by its roads, when the reason that brought the previous inhabitants here has dissolved into history? What do you do, in other words, with a city waiting to become itself again? And so the Roman city passed into silence. And the silence lasted longer than most civilizations last. And when people came back to the Thames, they did not come back to the place Rome had built, but to a stretch of open shore, a little to the west, where the tide came in, and the boats could be pulled up, and the business of living near a good river could begin again, without the weight of all that old stone pressing down on it. We can move forward now, into the centuries that historians used to call the Dark Ages, and have since had to revise their opinion of, into a time when London was not one city but two, and the relationship between them tells us something important about how places survive. A new settlement was growing beside the Strand, and it had its own logic, its own trade routes, its own particular understanding of what a city on a tidal river was for. Picture a Saxon merchant on the open shore near what would become the Strand, in the grey early light before the other traders have arrived at the waterfront, loading goods into a flat-bottomed boat that is pulled up on the mud just above the tide line. He is not thinking about Rome. He has no reason to think about Rome. The walled city sits a little to the east, empty and grass-grown, its walls still standing, its roads still running to the gates that are no longer guarded by anyone, and he has almost certainly walked past it and through it and found it useful in the way that a large empty building is always useful to people who need stone for other things. But he is not living there. He is living here, on the open shore of a trading settlement called Londonwits. And the distinction matters more than it might appear. Londonwits is one of the more surprising chapters in London's long history, and it is surprising partly because it was hidden for so long. For most of the history of historical inquiry into London, scholars assumed that the post-Roman settlement of the area must have taken place within the Roman walls, that the Saxon inhabitants of the Thames Valley would naturally have gravitated toward the most substantial existing infrastructure available to them and built their new lives inside the old boundary. It was not until the 1980s and 1990s, when archaeological excavations in the area around the Strand and Covent Garden began producing material that was unmistakably Saxon in date and character, that the full picture of what had happened in the post-Roman centuries became clear. The Saxon settlement was not inside the walls. It was to the west, on the foreshore of the river, in a location that made perfect sense for the kind of economy it was operating, but that required letting go of the assumption that the Roman city's footprint was automatically the obvious place to be. The reasons for this choice are worth understanding, because they illuminate something about the different kinds of economy the different kinds of city serve. Roman Londinium had been primarily a city of administration and long-distance trade, a node in an imperial network that could direct goods and people and money across thousands of miles according to the logic of a centralized state. When that network collapsed, the infrastructure it had built did not automatically become useful for the different kind of economy that replaced it, which was smaller in scale, more flexible in its organization, and oriented toward the tidal river and the North Sea, rather than toward the roads that led to the interior of a province that no longer existed as such. The foreshore of the Thames west of the old walls offered something that the walled city did not: direct access to the water, the ability to beach boats on the shore and conduct trade without the mediation of a formal port infrastructure, the flexibility of an open-shore emporium that could adapt to the rhythms of tidal trade without being constrained by the fixed geography of a Roman harbour beel, for different purposes. What Londonwich traded in and with whom is reasonably well established from the archaeological record of the site and from comparative evidence across the network of similar shore markets that developed along the coasts of Britain and Northern Europe in the early medieval period. The goods recovered from excavations in the Strand and Covent Garden area include pottery from what is now France and the Low Countries, glass of continental manufacture, metalwork that shows connections to Frankish and Scandinavian production centres, and the bones of animals and fish that speak to a diet and a food economy that was both local and connected to wider supply networks. The trade partners were the Frankish kingdoms across the Channel, the Frisian merchants who dominated the North Sea coastal trade in the 6th and 7th centuries, and eventually the Scandinavian communities whose networks would become, in a rather different form, the source of the raids that would eventually destroy Lundennwich as an open settlement. The settlement grew across the 7th and 8th centuries into something substantial, a community of perhaps 10,000 people at its height, with workshops and houses and markets and at least one church, the minster that would eventually become the core of what is now St. Martin in the Fields, sitting on its slight rise above the foreshore and providing the spiritual infrastructure that any functioning early medieval community required. The name Lundennwich is itself significant. The second element, wick, is an Old English term that refers specifically to this kind of trading settlement, a port or market town, oriented toward commerce rather than toward military or administrative functions, and its application to the settlement on the Strand is the clearest possible indication of what the place understood itself to be. Rest here for a moment, beside the river, in the early light of a morning that could be any morning in the 2 centuries of Londonwit's flourishing. The boats are on the shore. The market is beginning to come alive with the sounds of traders setting out their goods, the calls of people who have crossed the channel and are now trying to make themselves understood in a language that is similar enough to their own to be manageable. The smell of food being prepared somewhere behind the waterfront in the domestic quarter of the settlement. The walled city sits to the east, its silence a presence rather than an absence, the ghost of Rome keeping its patient distance from the new thing happening on the shore. The threat when it came was not gradual. The Viking raids on the trading settlements of Britain and Northern Europe began in the late 8th century and intensified across the first decades of the 9th with a speed and violence that the open-shore emporiums of the coast were particularly ill-equipped to handle. Lundennwich was not a fortified settlement. It had no walls, no organized military garrison, no defensive infrastructure of any kind, because walls and garrisons and fortifications are the equipment of a political entity, of a city that understands itself as a node of power rather than a node of trade, and Lundennwich had not understood itself as either of those things. The open shore that made it such an efficient trading platform also made it completely exposed to anyone arriving by water with hostile intent. The raids on London are documented in sources that are sparse enough to be frustrating and detailed enough to be frightening. A raid in 842 caused what the sources describe as great slaughter. A more serious attack followed, and the settlement appears to have been significantly damaged or temporarily abandoned in the decades that followed, as Viking forces, no longer content with seasonal raiding, began wintering in Britain and operating as a persistent military presence rather than a periodic threat. The foreshore of Lundennwich became dangerous in a way that it had never been designed to accommodate. And the question of what to do about this was not simply a question of military strategy, but a question about what kind of place London should be, what kind of economy it should serve, and what kind of physical form would allow it to go on serving that economy in conditions that had changed Fundame, nally from those in which the settlement had been established. The answer was provided, with characteristic decisiveness, by Alfred, King of Wessex, who in 886 reoccupied the walled Roman site on the north bank of the Thames and made it once again the working city that it had not been for 4 centuries. Alfred is one of the figures in English history about whom it is genuinely difficult to be objective, partly because the historical sources for his reign are unusually rich by the standards of the period, and partly because the sources that survive are in significant measure the product of his own court's literary output, which creates an obvious problem of perspective. What can be said with reasonable confidence is that he was a king of considerable strategic intelligence, that he understood the problem of Viking raids not as a series of discrete military crises to be managed individually, but as a structural challenge requiring a structural response, and that the reoccupation of Londinium was part of a systematic program of fortified settlements, the burhs, de Namurs, signed to provide the population of his kingdom with defensible positions within a day's travel of anywhere in the territory he controlled. London's inclusion in this network was not incidental. The walled city offered something that no new site could have provided without enormous expenditure of labor and resources, which was a pre-existing set of defenses that, though 400 years old and in need of repair, still defined a substantial enclosed space capable of sheltering a large population and resisting attack. The Roman walls were not demolished and replaced. They were repaired, reinforced, and integrated into a new defensive system that added a riverside embankment and organized the interior of the walled area on a grid of streets designed to ensure that every part of the enclosed space could be quickly reached by defenders from any of several access points. This grid, known to historians as the Alfredian Street Plan, is still partially legible in the geography of the modern city, another layer of intentional planning overlaid on the bones of the Roman street network, and subtly different from it, the mark of a specific historical moment when a king with a clear strategic vision imposed a new order on an ancient space. What Alfred did in London was not simply military in character, though the military dimension was central to his purposes. He also reformed the markets that would operate within the reoccupied city, establishing the commercial infrastructure that would allow Londinium to resume its function as a center of trade, while operating from within a defensible perimeter rather than on an exposed foreshore. The coinage was reformed. New coins minted with Alfred's image and the name of the city in a form that explicitly connected the new settlement to the Roman one. Not Londonwich, the Saxon shore market, but Lundenburg, the fortified city, a name whose second element, like the Latin burgus, meant a defended place, a settlement that knew what it was and what it needed to be protected. The merchants who had operated on the Strand foreshore were not simply expelled from their previous location. They were redirected. The trade they had been conducting pulled inside the walls and organized around markets that now operated under royal oversight within a space that could be defended when the boats came up the river with hostile intent. The transition from Lundewich to the reoccupied Lundenburg was not instantaneous, and the old settlement on the Strand does not seem to have been entirely abandoned overnight. There is evidence of continued activity in the area west of the walls for some time after 886, the habits of trade and residence being slower to shift than the political decisions that nominally directed them. But the direction of change was clear, and within a generation or two, the center of gravity of London had definitively moved back inside the Roman walls, and the open shore of London West was becoming the suburb of a city rather than the city itself, the landscape of what would eventually become the Strand and Covent Garden settling into a different kind of relationship with the urban center that lay to its east. The Vikings did not simply go away because Alfred had built his burhs and reoccupied his walled cities. They continued to be a presence in the political life of England for the next century and more, raiding when they could and settling where they were able. And London was fought over and occupied and fought over again before the period of Viking incursion was finally resolved, not by expulsion, but by absorption. The Scandinavian communities of Britain becoming English by degrees across the 10th and 11th centuries in the way that immigrant communities have always become English, which is to say imperfectly and gradually and with an enormous amount of mutual influence running in both directions. The Viking contribution to what London was becoming in this period is not negligible. Place names, personal names, patterns of trade, legal concepts, the word itself that the city would eventually use for its own administrative unit. All of these carry Scandinavian fingerprints, evidence of a century and more of contact that was sometimes violent and sometimes commercial and always transformative. What Alfred had understood, and what the subsequent history of the reoccupied city would confirm, was that the Roman walls were not simply a military asset, but a kind of gift that one civilization had left for another, a set of conditions that could be inhabited and built upon without having been built in the first place by the people who would benefit from them. The walls defined a space. The space had a logic. The logic shaped what could be done there in ways that neither the Romans who built them nor the Saxon king who repaired them could have fully anticipated or planned for. Standing inside those walls in that year, looking at the grass-grown ruins of a city that had once been the capital of a province, Alfred was doing something that London would do again and again across its subsequent history, inheriting a situation not of his making and finding in it the raw materials for something new. The particular quality of that inheritance is worth dwelling on, because it is one of the things that distinguishes London from cities that were built in a single act of foundation and have remained more or less continuous with that founding moment. To inherit a city is different from building one. It means accepting constraints that you did not choose, working within a framework whose logic you may not fully understand, making use of infrastructure whose original purposes are no longer entirely legible, but whose physical reality still shapes every decision you make. Alfred could not simply design the city he wanted. He had to design the city that the existing walls and streets and topography made possible. And the city that emerged from that design process was already, in some fundamental sense, a negotiation between his intentions and the intentions of people who had been dead for 4 centuries. London has been that kind of negotiation ever since. There is a detail about Alfred's management of London that tends to get overlooked in accounts that focus on the military and political dimensions of his reoccupation of the walled city. And it is the detail that most clearly shows his understanding of what a city actually requires to function. He appointed a man called Ethelred, an ealdorman, a senior nobleman of his kingdom, as the effective governor of London. And what this meant in practice was that the city was being placed under a form of royal supervision that gave it both protection and direction without simply absorbing it into the administrative machinery of the Wessex kingdom. London was valuable precisely because it was a trading city, and trading cities require a degree of commercial autonomy that purely administrative arrangements tend to undermine. Alfred understood this, or understood it well enough, to create a framework that gave the city's merchants and craftsmen the conditions they needed to prosper while ensuring that the crown benefited from the prosperity they generated. The markets that operated within the reoccupied city were organized in ways that are still partially legible in the place names of the modern city. Cheapside, the great market street that ran through the heart of the medieval and early modern city, takes its name from the Old English seep, meaning a market or a bargain, the same word that gives us cheap in the sense of inexpensive, and that appears in the names of specialist markets clustered along and around the main street: Bread Street, Milk Street, honey lane, poultry, all of them record in G, the specific commodities that were sold in specific locations within the market geography that was already forming in the late Saxon period. The organization of trade by commodity and by location is a characteristic of markets that have reached a certain scale, a point at which the informal arrangements of a smaller trading community give way to a more systematic organization that makes it easier for buyers to find what they need and for the authorities overseeing the market to regulate quality and taxation. London reached that point in the 9th and 10th centuries, and the street names that resulted have persisted for over 1,000 years. The city that emerged from Alfred's reoccupation and from the century of Scandinavian pressure and eventual accommodation that followed was not the same city that the Romans had built, and not simply because different people were living in it. It was a city with a different relationship to the political structures above it, a different source of wealth, and a different understanding of its own identity. Roman Londinium had been a creation of imperial policy, imposed on the landscape from above by an administrative system that gave it its purpose and its resources, and could, ultimately, withdraw both. The Saxon and Dano-Norse London that was forming in the late 9th and 10th centuries was something more self-generated. A city whose commercial life had roots in local exchange and in the cross-channel trade networks of the North Sea world, and whose population had a relationship to the place that was older and more various than any single political authority had created. When Alfred reoccupied the walls, he was not creating a new city. He was giving an existing community a new form, a new set of physical conditions within which to pursue the activities it had been pursuing for generations. This is a distinction that matters because it shapes what the city became in the centuries that followed and why it survived the pressures that would destroy other cities less organically rooted in the specific economics of their location. We can move forward now, across 2 more centuries of the city's steady expansion within its walls and the growing complexity of the world around it, to the autumn of 1066, when everything about the political organization of England changed in the space of a single October afternoon, and London found itself, as it would find itself repeatedly across its long history, in the position of being the most important prize available to whoever had just won a war. The city that Alfred had rebuilt inside the Roman walls had grown and prospered across the 10th and 11th centuries, accumulating wealth and population and institutional complexity in the way that successful trading cities always do. And its prosperity had made it, by the time William of Normandy landed his invasion force on the Sussex coast, the most significant city in England by a considerable margin. What happened next would define the relationship between the city and the crown for the following 8 centuries, and it began not with a battle, but with a negotiation. William the Conqueror had just won the Kingdom of England by force of arms. At a battle near Hastings on the 14th of October, 1066, that killed the English King Harold and destroyed the military force that had stood between the Norman invasion and everything north and west of the Sussex Downs. He was, by any reasonable measure, in a position to take whatever he wanted, from whoever he chose, by whatever means seemed most expedient. He had an army. He had momentum. He had the authority of a decisive military victory and the backing of a papacy that had endorsed his claim to the English throne before the first Norman soldier had set foot on English soil. What he did not have and what he needed before his conquest could be considered complete was London. The problem with London, from a military conqueror's perspective, was that it was not simply a city in the sense of an inhabited settlement that could be taken by surrounding it and starving it into submission, or by assaulting its walls until they gave way. It was also an economic entity, a center of trade and finance and civic administration, whose value derived precisely from the activities of the people within it, and those activities could not be compelled. You could take London by force. You could not make London function by force. The merchants who had made the city wealthy would simply stop being merchants or stop being present if the conditions that made their activities possible were destroyed by a conquest that treated the city as a site of plunder rather than a source of ongoing revenue. William understood this, or was advised by people who understood it, and so he made a different calculation. The negotiation that took place between William's forces and the leading men of London in the weeks after Hastings is documented in sources that are, as so often with events of this period, incomplete and somewhat contradictory, but its outline is clear enough. London agreed to submit to William's authority, and William agreed to respect the existing laws and customs of the city, to protect its commerce and its civic organization, and to grant it a charter confirming its rights and privileges under the new regime. The charter that bears William's name, addressed to the bishop and the portreeve and all the citizens of London, is a brief document, no more than a few lines in the original, but its implications were enormous. It meant that London was not being absorbed into the new Norman political system on Norman terms, but was maintaining its existing identity within that system, while acknowledging a new ultimate authority over it. The bargain of 1066, protection in exchange for money and administration, was the template for every subsequent negotiation between the English crown and the City of London, and it is a bargain that echoes in recognizable form in the peculiar constitutional position of the City of London to the present day. The Tower of London, which William began to build almost immediately after the conquest, was the physical expression of the other side of this bargain. It was not built as a civic amenity or as a symbol of royal munificence toward a valued partner. It was built as a statement of power, a structure large enough and strong enough and positioned close enough to the river and the city walls to make absolutely clear that while London might retain its laws and its markets and its civic customs, the ultimate authority over all of those things resided in a man who had the means to enforce his will if the bargain was ever broken. The White Tower, the square Norman keep at the heart of the complex, rose in the 1070s and 1080s to a height and on a scale that nothing in London could match. A piece of architecture whose primary function was to be seen and understood by everyone who looked at it, which is to say, by everyone in the city, as the permanent physical presence of royal power. Pause here and consider what London looked like in the decades immediately after the conquest. Because the physical city of this period was very different from both the Roman city that had preceded it and the great medieval city that would follow. The Norman conquest brought a new aristocracy, a new administrative language, and a new set of architectural ambitions to a city that had been developing along distinctly English lines, and the resulting combination was neither purely Norman nor purely English, but something hybrid, something that bore the marks of its multiple inheritances without being reducible to any one of them. Norman French became the language of the court and the law, coexisting with English in the streets and the markets, in a linguistic situation that would take several centuries to resolve itself into the Middle English of Chaucer and his contemporaries, which was itself a fusion of the two strands in proportions that varied by context and by class. The economic life of the city in the 12th and 13th centuries was shaped by a set of trading relationships that were already international in character and that would become more so as the medieval centuries progressed. The wool trade was the engine of the English medieval economy in a way that is difficult to overstate. England produced wool of a quality that continental weavers, particularly in Flanders, could not match with their own domestic supply, and the export of raw wool and the import of finished cloth represented the single largest commercial flow in the northwestern European economy for several centuries. London was the primary point through which this trade flowed, the port through which the wool bales left and the finished cloth arrived. the city where the merchants who organized the trade built their warehouses and their counting houses and their guild halls, and the wealth generated by this trade was the foundation on which the great medieval city was built. London Bridge was the physical center of this commercial activity, not merely because it was the only bridge across the tidal Thames, and therefore the mandatory point of transit for all goods and people moving between the city and the south of England, but because the bridge itself had become a commercial entity, lined with shops and houses and a chapel dedicated to Thomas Becket, who had been born and within sight of the river and had been murdered in his cathedral to the southeast. The bridge in its medieval form was not the kind of structure that modern visitors to London encounter. It was a narrow lane flanked on both sides by buildings that rose several stories above the road surface, creating a covered, dark, noisy, profitable commercial street suspended above the tidal river at the point where London had always crossed. The tolls collected at the bridge were a significant source of revenue for its maintainers, and the heads of traitors and enemies displayed on poles above the southern gatehouse were as much a statement of commercial and civic authority as they were of judicial power. The guilds that organized this trade were among the most consequential civic institutions in medieval London, controlling access to particular trades, setting standards of quality, and providing their members with a social and legal framework that was, in many respects, as significant in daily life as the formal machinery of royal or municipal government. The livery companies that survive today, with their halls and their ceremonies and their charitable endowments, are the direct descendants of these medieval guilds, and the continuity of institutional form across 7 or 8 centuries is itself a kind of evidence for the depth of the structures that medieval London built. The Italian banking families who had established themselves in the city by the 13th century added another layer of financial sophistication to what was already a complex commercial environment. Lombard Street, still the heart of the banking district of the modern city of London, takes its name from the merchants of Lombardy, who made it their base in the medieval period, bringing with them techniques of credit and exchange that were more advanced than anything native English commercial practice had developed. The capacity to move money across distances without physically transporting it, to extend credit across months and years on the basis of documented obligations, to manage the financial complexity of large-scale international trade. All of these were skills that the Italian merchants imported into the London economy and that the city's own commercial class learned and adapted and eventually made it its own. The combination of English wool, Flemish weaving, Italian banking, and London's position as the political and administrative capital of an increasingly centralized kingdom made the medieval city a place of economic dynamism that could absorb setbacks and keep growing in a way that less fortunately positioned cities could not. The setback that came in 1348 was not of the ordinary kind that a dynamic economy absorbs and moves past. The Black Death arrived in England in the late summer of that year, carried by fleas on rats arriving on trading ships from the continent, and it killed perhaps a third of the population of England within 2 years, in some places more. London, as the most densely populated city in the country and one of the most active ports, was among the worst affected places in the kingdom, and the effects on the city's population, economy, and social structure were both immediate and long-lasting in ways that reshaped what London was as thoroughly as any military conquest or political settlement had done. Let the city rest in the autumn of 1348, just as the plague is arriving, and feel the particular quality of what is about to happen to it. The markets are busy. The bridge is crowded. The guild halls are full of the business of prosperous trades. The Italian bankers are at their ledgers in Lombard Street. The river is doing what the river does. None of this is going to stop exactly. But all of it is going to change, and the change is going to come from a direction that no military strategy and no diplomatic negotiation and no investment in defensive walls could have addressed. Because it is going to come from the air and the fleas and the invisible biology of a disease that does not distinguish between the powerful and the powerless. Between the well-fed and the starving. Between the merchant who has made a great fortune trading in wool and the laborer who loaded the bales onto the ships. The mortality was staggering in the most literal sense of the word, meaning it had the effect of a physical blow on a population's ability to stand upright and continue functioning. Whole streets emptied. Whole trades were temporarily without practitioners. The ecclesiastical institutions of the city, which had been responsible for burying the dead in the normal course of events, could not cope with the number of bodies, and emergency burial grounds were opened outside the walls, some of which have been identified by archaeologists and tell their own story of what happened in those 2 terrible years. The city did not collapse. Its institutional structures, the guilds, the courts, the civic offices that had been developing across the 2 centuries since the Norman conquest, proved more robust than the individuals who staffed them, and as people died and were replaced by others who moved into the city from the surrounding region, the institutions continue to function, imperfectly and at reduced capacity but recognizably. What the plague changed across the decades that followed its first terrible visitation and its subsequent returns was the social arithmetic of English life in ways that eventually favored the surviving laborers and disadvantaged the landowners and employers who had depended on a large supply of cheap labor. When a third or more of the workforce dies, the surviving workforce becomes, very simply, more valuable, and the attempt by landowners and by the Crown to maintain pre-plague wage rates and pre-plague labor obligations through legislation could not, in the end, overcome the basic economic logic of scarcity. The Statute of Labourers of 1351, which attempted to fix wages at pre-plague levels, was partly enforceable and largely resented, and the resentment accumulated across the following 3 decades into the most dramatic episode of social violence that medieval London would experience. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 brought armed men from Kent and Essex to the walls of London in the early summer of that year, men whose grievances were specific and whose anger was focused on particular targets: the poll tax that had been levied to fund an expensive and inconclusive war, the legal mechanisms that maintained unfree labor obligations on people who felt that the world had changed anew, to justify their freedom, the specific individuals in government who were associated with policies that the rebels found intolerable. The city opened its gates to them, which is itself a significant fact, because it speaks to the degree to which the city's own population had grievances that aligned with those of the men arriving from the countryside. Some Londoners actively assisted the rebels, others stood aside. The civic authorities, the mayor and the aldermen, and the leading merchants who normally managed the city's relationship with the Crown, found themselves in a position of genuine uncertainty about where their interests and loyalties lay. The rebellion reached its peak and its crisis within a few days. The rebels burned the Savoy Palace, the residence of John of Gaunt, who was among the most hated figures in the kingdom, and they stormed the Tower of London, where they killed the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Treasurer of England, 2 of the specific individuals whose policies had provoked the revolt. The young King Richard II, 14 years old, met the rebels at Smithfield, just outside the city walls, in an encounter whose outcome depended on the nerve and quick thinking of the Mayor of London, William Walworth, who killed the rebel leader Wat Tyler when a confrontation between Tyler and the King's party turned violent, and whose decisive action in that moment gave the King the opportunity to face the rebel army alone and persuade it to disperse on promises that were subsequently not kept. The revolt collapsed as quickly as it had gathered, and the reprisals that followed were real, but not as sweeping as they might have been, partly because the crown could not afford the instability that mass executions would have created, and partly because the underlying grievances of the rebels had enough legitimacy that even those who suppressed the revolts were aware that something had to change. What changed over the following decades was the slow erosion of the unfree labor obligations that the rebels had demanded be abolished, not through legislation, but through the practical impossibility of maintaining a system that an increasingly scarce and economically empowered labor force simply refused to cooperate with. The city that emerged from plague and revolt was in some respects a different place from the one that had entered them. The workshops had been refilled, often by immigrants from the Low Countries and from further afield, who brought new skills and new commercial connections. The markets had reopened. The guilds had adapted their membership and their practices to a changed economic environment, and the civic institutions that had bent under the pressure of the two crises had not broken. This is what the closing reflection of this section points toward, and it is worth stating clearly what proved resilient in medieval London was not any particular individual or dynasty or political arrangement, all of which changed considerably across the century between 1348 and the mid-15th century, but the accumulated density of the city's investment in itself, the thickness of its commeria, social and civic life, the sheer weight of habit and infrastructure and interconnection that made it worth rebuilding every time. The plague killed enormous numbers of people. The revolt brought violence inside the walls. Neither event erased what the city was or made it stop being worth living in and trading in and governing from. London recovered, as it always recovered, not because of any single act of will or leadership, but because enough people, enough of the time, continued to find it worth recovering. The medieval city survived its plagues and its revolts, refilled itself with new people and new trades, and kept growing through the 15th century and into the 16th in the way that prosperous cities grow when the conditions for prosperity remain broadly intact, which is to say, sideways as much as upward, spilling beyond its walls into the fields and villages that surrounded it, changing the character of the surrounding landscape without quite planning to, becoming something larger and more complicated than any single institution or authority could fully describe. We can move forward now into the Tudor century, when the city's expansion beyond its walls became rapid enough to be noticed and commented on, and when a sequence of events beginning in the 1530s and ending in a fire in 1666 would demolish the physical fabric of the medieval city and replace it with something that more closely resembles what the visitor to London encounters today. The Tudor expansion and the Great Fire are usually treated as separate episodes in London's history, and in one sense they are, but they are also part of a single long process by which the city outgrew the form that history had given it and found, in catastrophe, the opportunity to take a new one. It is the morning after the Great Fire of 1666, and a Londoner is standing on the high ground to the north of the city, where the fields of Moorfields and Islington rise above the floodplain, looking south across what was, 4 days ago, the largest and densest urban area in England, and is now, or is becoming, as the last fires die down and the smoke shifts in the September wind, a vast field of rue, bibble, and ash, and standing chimneys from which the roofs and floors have been burned away, leaving the brick and stone of what remains pointing at the sky like the teeth of something very old. The medieval city of London, centuries in the making, accumulated layer by layer across 600 years of continuous habitation and rebuilding and expansion, is gone, not damaged, not partially destroyed, gone, across an area of roughly 400 hectares, taking with it something like 13,000 houses, 87 parish churches, the old St. Paul's Cathedral, the Royal Exchange, the Custom House, most of the company halls of the livery companies, and the dense commercial and residential fabric of streets and lanes and alleys that had been the working core of the city since before the Normans arrived. The fire had begun in a bakery on Pudding Lane in the early hours of the 2nd of September 1666, in conditions of extreme drought following a hot, dry summer, and had spread westward on a strong east wind through streets so narrow and buildings so close together and so thoroughly constructed of timber and thatch that once it had established itself among the warehouses near the bridge, there was essentially no containing it. Samuel Pepys, the naval administrator and diarist whose account of the fire is among the most vivid documents of the 17th century, was woken by a maid and went to his window in the early morning and saw the glow in the east and went back to bed, thinking it not much. He was wrong by an order of magnitude that became apparent within hours as the fire moved through the city at a pace that outstripped every attempt to fight it. The firefighting technology of the period being entirely inadequate to a conflagration of this scale, the primary technique of creating fire breaks by demolishing buildings in the path of the fire being attempted too late and too selectively to have any significant effect. The destruction was so complete and the scale of what needed to be rebuilt so overwhelming that it produced in the days and weeks that followed the fire a remarkable flourishing of planning ambitions, as architects and surveyors and men of civic vision produced schemes for a rebuilt London that would rationalize its ancient street pattern, impose order on its organic medieval geography, and create a city worthy of the commercial and imperial ambitions that England was developing in this period. Christopher Wren produced a plan. John Evelyn produced a plan. Several others produced plans of varying ambition and practicality. All of them proposed wide avenues and formal piazzas and a logic of urban organization that bore very little resemblance to the city that had just burned, and none of them was built, because the practical reality of rebuilding a city of hundreds of thousands of people was governed not by aesthetic ambition, but by the pre-existing pattern of property ownership, which survived the fire intact as a seize of legal relationships, even though the physical buildings that had expressed those relationships had been entirely destroyed. What this meant in practice was that the new London was built on the footprint of the old one, following the same street lines and the same property boundaries and the same basic geography of use and access that the medieval city had established over centuries of incremental growth. The houses that replaced the burned ones were required by the new building regulations to be of brick rather than timber, and the streets were required to be wider than they had been, and the regulations specified minimum standards of construction that the medieval city had never imposed. But the city that rose from the ruins across the following decade was recognizably continuous with the one that had burned, its geography shaped by the same underlying logic of property and access that the fire had been unable to erase. Stand still for a moment and think about what that means. The Great Fire destroyed everything above ground across an enormous area of the most densely built city in England. It destroyed the buildings and the streets they lined, and the churches that marked the intersections and the halls that housed the guilds and the warehouses that stored the goods of a great trading city. And then the city was rebuilt in substantially the same place, following substantially the same lines, because the invisible infrastructure of ownership and obligation and use that underlay the physical city was more durable than the timber and thatch that expressed it. The fire could destroy what London looked like. It could not destroy what London was. What the fire could and did change was the aesthetic character of the city. And here Christopher Wren's contribution, though it fell far short of his comprehensive planning ambitions, was genuinely transformative. He was given the commission to rebuild 52 of the 87 parish churches destroyed in the fire, and he did so across a period of nearly 40 years, producing buildings that are among the finest examples of English Baroque architecture and that imposed on the skyline of the city a visual order that the medieval tangle of streets and lanes below them could not provide. The steeples of the city churches, each different from the others and each carefully designed to be visible from specific viewpoints within the city, created a three-dimensional map of the urban space that gave the rebuilt city a legible character it had never previously possessed. And above all of them, Wren's new St. New, Paul's Cathedral, under construction from 1675 and completed in 1711, rose on the hill above the river in a dome that consciously referenced the great domes of Rome and Florence, while being unmistakably English in its restraint and its particularity. The economic consequences of the fire were as significant as the architectural ones, and they produced one of the more interesting innovations in London's long history of financial creativity: insurance. As a formal commercial product designed to spread the risk of property loss across a large pool of premium-paying participants, had existed in embryonic forms in maritime contexts before 1666, but the fire demonstrated in the most direct possible way the need for a mechanism by which property owners could protect themselves against catastrophic loss. And within a few years of the fire, the first fire insurance offices had been established in London, offering coverage against exactly the kind of disaster that had just destroyed the city. The economic logic was compelling. If enough property owners paid a relatively small annual premium into a common pool, the pool could compensate those whose property was destroyed without any individual contributor having to bear the full cost of their own loss. This logic, which seems obvious in retrospect, was genuinely new in its application to property, and the fire insurance offices of post-fire London were the direct ancestors of the insurance industry that would make Lloyd's of London one of the most important financial institutions in the world. The dissolution of the monasteries under Henry VIII in the 1530s and 1540s had released an enormous quantity of land into private ownership, much of it in and around London, and the development of this land across the following century had profoundly altered the physical character of the city and its surroundings. The monastic precincts that had occupied large areas within and immediately outside the old walls, operated by institutions that had no commercial incentive to develop their land for profit, had been replaced by a mixture of aristocratic mansions, middle-class housing, commercial premises, and the theatres and other entertainments that flourished in the liberties outside the city's formal jurisdiction, the areas where the guilds and the civic authorities of the old city had no power to regulate what happened. The playhouses of Bankside, including the Globe where Shakespeare's plays were performed, were built in precisely this zone of relative regulatory freedom on the south bank of the river, where the city's writ did not run and where the entertainment industry of the late 16th and early 17th century could operate without interference. The printing presses clustered around St. Lade. Paul's churchyard transformed the city's relationship to information in ways that the medieval city could not have imagined. Books and pamphlets and later newspapers circulated through London's coffee houses, which were becoming the informal meeting places of a civic culture developing a taste for debate and a habit of reading the news in public, sharing printed sheets across a table in a room that smelled of coffee and tobacco, and the particular intellectual energy of a city that had begun to understand itself as an actor in a larger world. The city that emerged from the fire and the rebuilding was not simply a newer version of the medieval one. It was a different kind of city, more self-conscious about its own identity, more accustomed to thinking about itself in print, more confident of its commercial importance, and more willing to invest in the physical infrastructure of that importance. The new St. Maust, Paul's Cathedral, when it was finally completed in 1711, stood at the summit of this transformation, a building that was, in every sense, a statement of what the rebuilt London understood itself to be. It was larger than the medieval cathedral it replaced, It was built in the style that consciously connected the commercial capital of a Protestant mercantile nation to the great architectural traditions of Rome, demonstrating that English culture was not provincial or peripheral, but continuous with the classical inheritance that all educated Europeans shared. It was visible from the river, from the south bank, from the hills to the north, from the open water of the estuary, a dome that announced the presence of the city to anyone approaching it from any direction. The physical centerpiece of a skyline that London had spent most of its history without possessing, because the medieval city had never needed or wanted to be seen from a distance in the way that the new one did. What the fire had done, in the end, was to give the city the opportunity to become the physical expression of what it already was economically and commercially, to replace a built environment that was the accumulated product of centuries of incremental growth with one that could, within its constraints, more clearly express the ambitions of a city that had survived everything thrown at it and was ready, in the early decades of the 18th century, to become something genuinely new. The street lines were the same. The property boundaries were the same. The river was the same. But the buildings were different, built to different standards, in different materials, under different regulations. And the city that had emerged from the rubble was not lesser than what had burned, but better equipped, harder to burn, more formally organized, and crowned with a cathedral dome that would remain the defining feature of the London skyline for the next 2.5 centuries. This is what London had always done, and what it would keep doing. It had taken the disaster, whatever the disaster happened to be, and found in the space that the disaster opened up the possibility of doing what it had been doing anyway, only better and on clearer terms. The city's identity had proved to be something that lived not in its buildings, but in the uses to which those buildings were put, in the commercial relationships and civic habits and patterns of daily life that continued through the fire and beyond it, finding new physical forms while remaining recognizably themselves. The rebuilt London was not a new city. It was the same city in a better coat, and the coat was already beginning to feel too small for what the city was becoming. The Tudor city that preceded the fire was, in several respects, a different kind of place from the medieval city that had existed before the dissolution of the monasteries, and the difference is most clearly visible in the way that the physical landscape of London changed in the century between Henry VIII's religious reforms and the fire that destroyed what those reforms had helped to create. The monasteries and priories and convents that had occupied so much of the land within and around the old walls had not simply been religious institutions in the sense that they served a spiritual function. They had been landowners, employers, providers of charity and hospitality and education, organizers of significant agricultural and commercial activity on their estates, and their dissolution remorimi eased all of this accumulated institutional capacity into a different kind of market, one driven by individual commercial ambition rather than by the collective spiritual purposes that had previously directed the use of that land. The new owners who purchased monastic land in London and its surroundings included members of the court, wealthy merchants, speculators who understood that a rapidly growing city would need to expand, and that the land on which it would expand was becoming available at prices that reflected the religious crisis rather than the commercial opportunity, and the combination of political change and economic calculation produced a wave of development that transformed the physical city faster than anything since the Roman construction of Londinium. Great houses rose on former monastic sites. Streets were extended into fields that had been farmed by monks. The areas to the north and west of the old walls, which had been open land within living memory, began to acquire the character of suburbs, populated by a mixture of the wealthy who wanted space and garden, and the poor who could not afford to live within the walls, that the prosperous commercial city was making increasingly expensive. The theatres of Bankside and the pleasure gardens that developed around them were the most visible cultural product of this expansion into unregulated space. But they were not the only one. The concentration of printing trades around St. Paul's churchyard, close to the commercial heart of the city, but operating with a degree of independence that the proximity of the great church both enabled and occasionally threatened, was another. The coffee houses that began to appear in the 1650s and spread rapidly across the following decades occupied the intersections of commercial and intellectual life in a way that was entirely new and entirely characteristic of the city that London was becoming, a place where the exchange of information and the exchange of goods took place in overlapping spaces, where the merchant and the pamphleteer and the insurer and the politician sat at adjacent tables and shared the news that each of them needed for his own different purposes. The Great Plague of 1665, which killed somewhere between 70,000 and 100,000 Londoners in a single terrible year, was the last serious visitation of bubonic plague in England, and its particular horror lay partly in the contrast between the scale of the death and the relative normalcy of what surrounded it. A prosperous and commercially dynamic city going about its business, the dying in enormous numbers in the narrow streets where the disease moved most efficiently from household to household and from flea to person to person. Samuel Pepys wrote about it too, with the same combination of meticulous observation and honest self-interest that characterizes his account of the fire that followed a year later, noting the red crosses painted on the doors of infected houses, the carts collecting the dead at night, the way in which the city's commercial life continued in a diminished and anxious form, even as the mortality mounted through the summer months. The plague ended as plagues end, which is to say, it burned through the available population of susceptible individuals and then retreated, leaving the city depleted but characteristically not broken. It was into this city, still recovering from the plague, still carrying the psychological weight of a year in which tens of thousands of its inhabitants had died within its walls, that the fire arrived in the autumn of 1666 and completed, in 4 days, a physical transformation that the plague could not have achieved in decades. The combination of the two catastrophes, following so closely on each other, might reasonably have broken the confidence of a city in its own future, might have produced the kind of retreat and contraction that other cities had experienced when struck by comparable disasters. It did not. The response to the fire was immediate and practical and, in its way, characteristic. The city organized itself to rebuild, created the legal and financial mechanisms that rebuilding required, and got on with the work of becoming what it intended to be next. The city that remade itself in brick after the fire kept growing, through the 18th century and into the 19th, at a rate that would eventually produce something without precedent in human history. A city of more than 1 million people, then 2 million, then 4, absorbing the surrounding villages and market towns and fields into its expanding mass and becoming, by the middle of the 18th century, the largest urban agglomeration the world had ever seen. We can move forward now into the age of steam and sewers and the underground railway and the empire whose administrative and financial heart London had become, into the moment when the city's growth outpaced every infrastructure designed to sustain it and produced, in consequence, a public health crisis so severe that it required one of the most ambitious engineering projects in the history of urban civilization to resolve. The rebuilt London of Wren's churches and Georgian terraces was becoming something else entirely, something that had no name yet because it had not existed before. A modern metropolis confronting for the first time the problems that only modern metropolises face. Joseph Bazalgette is standing in the mud of a construction trench beside the north bank of the Thames, somewhere in the area of what is now the Victoria Embankment, in the early 1860s, overseeing the laying of large-diameter sewer pipes that will, within a decade of their completion, end the cholera epidemics that have killed tens of thousands of Londoners over the preceding half-century. He is a civil engineer, a chief engineer of the Metropolitan Board of Works, a man who spent his working life solving problems of enormous practical complexity without ever seeking the kind of public recognition that soldiers and politicians and artists routinely receive. And he is the person who, more than anyone else in the 19th century, saved London from itself. The intercepting sewer system that he designed and built, a network of 160 kilometers of main sewers and more than 2,000 kilometers of subsidiary ones, collected the sewage that had previously flowed directly into the Thames and redirected it to treatment works downstream of the city, ending the contamination of the river and the drinking water supply that had driven the sea. Cholera outbreaks of 1832, 1848, 1854, and 1866, the Great Stink of 1858, when the summer heat made the smell of the Thames so overwhelming that Parliament could not conduct its business in the Riverside Chamber at Westminster, had finally produced the political will to fund what engineers had been recommending for years. Bazalgette built it. The cholera stopped. His name appears in no popular history of the Victorian age that is not specifically about engineering. And there is something in that absence that speaks to the way societies remember the dramatic and forget the structural. The problem that Bazalgette solved was a symptom of a larger transformation that had been underway since the early 19th century, as steam power and the mechanization of production and the concentration of industrial activity in cities drew population from the countryside faster than any previous economic change had done. London's population doubled between 1800 and 1850, and doubled again between 1850 and 1900, and the infrastructure of the city, its water supply and its sewage disposal and its street network and its housing stock, could not keep pace with growth at that rate without either massive investment or catastrophic failure. Both happened in sequence. The catastrophic failure came first, in the form of cholera epidemics and overcrowding and infant mortality rates that in some parts of the East End exceeded those of the most disease-ridden periods of the medieval city, and the massive investment followed, driven by a combination of genuine humanitarian concern, political pressure from a newly empowered municipal government, and the simple recognition that a city that killed its population at the rates that mid-Victorian London was killing its poor could not function as a commercial and imperial capital. The Underground Railway, the first in the world, opened in 1863 and was itself a response to the impossibility of moving the population of a city of 3 million through streets that had not been meaningfully widened since the medieval period. The journey from Paddington to Farringdon, that the first passengers made in open-sided carriages pulled by steam locomotives through tunnels that filled with smoke, was not comfortable, but it was faster than anything previously available in the city, and the speed was the point. Because a city the size of London was becoming ungovernable without the means to move large numbers of people through it, quickly and reliably. The Metropolitan line between Paddington and Farringdon, built by the cut-and-cover method that involved excavating the streets, laying the tunnel, and filling back in over it, was the first infrastructure project in the city since the Roman walls that changed the fundamental relationship between the people of London and the geography of the place they lived in. The ability to move quickly through the ground beneath the streets, to travel from one end of the city to another in minutes rather than hours, to live at a distance from the commercial centre that would have been unthinkable before the railway, reorganized the city spatially in ways that are still shaping it. The extension of the tube network into the fields north and west of the Victorian city sea, reaching the pattern of suburbs that the city's middle classes have been inhabiting ever since. The inequality that was being built into the fabric of the Victorian city was, by the standards of any previous century of London's history, extreme. The West End, where the aristocracy and the commercial upper classes had been building their elegant terraces and garden squares since the 18th century, was a different kind of city from the East End, where the docks and the factories and the overcrowded courts and alleys housed the workers whose labour made the commerce of the empire possible. Charles Booth's Surveys of London Poverty in the 1880s and 1890s, some of the earliest systematic social research conducted in any city, mapped the distribution of wealth and poverty across the streets of London with a precision that made visible what the commercial statistics of the period concealed, that the prosperity of the city as a whole coexisted with levels of destitution among its poorest inhabitants that were, by any measure, incompatible with the claims of the most powerful empire in the world to be a civilizing influence on anyone. Pause for a moment here. In the complexity of this, the city that had absorbed every disaster thrown at it, that had survived plague and fire and foreign conquest and peasant revolt, was in the 19th century also a city of terrible suffering, of children dying in infancy in numbers that shocked the investigators who counted them, of families living in single rooms in buildings that had been subdivided and subdivided again until the physical fabric of the housing was as overcrowded as the lives it contained. This is not a contradiction of the story of London's resilience. It is part of the same story, because the resilience of cities is not the same as the happiness of all the people who live in them. And London's capacity to keep growing and prospering at the level of the city as a whole was achieved in part on the backs of a large proportion of its population who saw very little of the prosperity they were helping to generate. The First World War transformed London's labour force in ways that the Victorian social structure had not anticipated and could not fully accommodate. Women entered paid employment in factories and offices and on public transport in numbers and in kinds of work that had previously been closed to them, not because attitudes had changed, but because the men who had previously done those jobs had gone to France, and the work needed to be done, and the women who did it were capable of it, and in many cases had been capable of it all along. The city's manufacturing capacity was redirected toward the production of munitions and equipment on a scale that would have been unimaginable to the Victorian industrialists who had built the factories, and the logistics of a city feeding and housing and transporting a wartime population while also producing the material of a modern industrial war tested the administrative capacity of the municipal government in ways that the peacetime city had not required. The Zeppelin raids of 1915 and 1916, the first aerial bombing of London, introduced the city to a new category of threat that it had not previously faced in its 2,000 years of occasional siege and conquest. The possibility that an enemy could kill civilians in their homes without ever bringing an army to the city gates. The damage done by the Zeppelins was limited compared to what the 20th century would eventually produce. But the psychological effect was significant. The first intimation that the air above London was no longer a neutral space, but a potential avenue of attack, that the city's inhabitants were not protected by the walls and the water that had defined its defences since the Romans built the first ones. The Blitz of 1940 and 1941 made real what the Zeppelin raids had prefigured. The German bombing campaign against London, which began in September 1940 and continued through the following spring, killed more than 30,000 Londoners and destroyed or damaged 130,000 buildings across every part of the city, but concentrated most heavily on the East End and the docks, the parts of the city that were most densely built and most economically vital to the port that had been London's commercial foundation since the Romans laid their first wharves along the North Bank. The iconic image of St. Paul's Cathedral, rising unharmed above the smoke and rubble of the surrounding streets, was not entirely accidental. a team of fire watchers stationed on the cathedral roof throughout the bombing, specifically to protect it from the incendiary bombs that fell on the surrounding area, had kept it from burning, making a choice, consciously and under significant personal risk, that the dome, which had defined London's skyline since 1711, should continue to do so. The Blitz did not break the city. The city continued to function, its population sheltering in the underground railway stations that had been built to move them around the city in peacetime and were now being used to protect them from the air, maintaining a social life of remarkable ordinariness. In the interstices of the bombing, the pubs still open, the markets still operating, the essential activities of a large city continuing. Around the damage, with a determination that was partly stoicism and partly the simple human refusal to let the difficulty of the present moment constitute the permanent reality of one's circumstances. The post-war decades brought a new population to London in the form of immigrants from the Caribbean and South Asia and West Africa and every other region of the former empire. People who came to the city in response to specific labor shortages and in response to the implicit promise that membership of the empire entitled the citizens of its constituent territories to share in the prosperity of its metropolitan centre. The arrival of the Empire Windrush at Tilbury in 1948, carrying several hundred Jamaican passengers who had been invited to help address the post-war labor shortage, is the conventional symbolic moment for this migration. Though the movement of people from the Commonwealth to Britain had begun before 1948 and would continue for decades after, what these new Londoners found was a city that was imperfectly welcoming at best, that offered employment and possibility while simultaneously subjecting its new residents to discrimination in housing and in employment and in the everyday encounters of a city that had not yet worked out how to be what it was in the process of becoming. The story of post-war London's absorption of its new populations is not a comfortable one, and the violence and exclusion that accompanied it belong as fully to the history of the city as the vitality and creativity that the new communities brought with them. The Notting Hill riots of 1958, the long history of discrimination in housing and employment that followed, the complex political battles over immigration law that shaped British politics for decades, all of these are part of what London was doing, which is the same thing it has always done, absorbing people from elsewhere into its fabric while creating conditions that were simultaneously more opaque and more hostile than either the newcomers or the established residents had expected. The communities that formed in Brixton and Notting Hill and Southall and the East End across the 1950s and 1960s and 1970s became, over the following decades, as fully part of what London is as any previous layer of arrivals, their food and their music and their children and their grandchildren, woven into the texture of the city in the way that the Flemish weavers and the Huguenot silk merchants and the Jewish refugees of previous centuries had been woven in before them. The Docklands redevelopment of the 1980s and 1990s, which transformed the derelict wharves and warehouses of the East End into the glass towers of Canary Wharf, was the latest in the long series of physical transformations through which London had periodically replaced one version of itself with another, while remaining recognizably the same place. The docks that were being redeveloped had been built to serve the commerce of an empire that no longer existed, and their redundancy was the direct consequence of the containerization of shipping, which had moved the port activity that had sustained the East End for centuries to the deep water facilities at Tilbury and beyond. The redevelopment that replaced them with financial services buildings and luxury housing, and eventually the Crossrail station that connected the new development to the rest of the city, was not a response to the needs of the people who had lived and worked in the area before the docks closed. It was a response to the needs of a financial services industry that required large amounts of modern office sea space close to the city's existing commercial core but unable to afford or obtain it within the square mile itself. The tension between these two kinds of need, between the established communities of a district and the commercial pressures that would transform that district out of recognition, is a tension that London has been navigating imperfectly and with constant conflict since long before the Docklands became a symbol of it. The city at the present moment, if you stand on the north bank of the Thames in the early light of a morning that could be any morning of the current century, and look at the skyline that has been changing every decade since the 1980s, presents a view that would have been literally unimaginable to anyone who looked at the same stretch of river at any previous point in the 2,000 years of the 10,000 years of the 10 city's history. Glass towers of a height and in a number that the pre-industrial city could not have conceived stand alongside the dome of Wren's St. Paul. Paul's and the spires of the churches he built to give the rebuilt city its skyline. And within a short walk of all of them, if you know where to look, sections of the Roman wall that defined the city in the 2nd century are still standing. The oldest visible fabric of the place, older than any other thing built by human hands in the city, still present in the urban texture 18 centuries. Tear the legions who built them went home. The Roman wall and the glass tower are not in contradiction with each other. They are the same city at different moments of its becoming. The same decision made at different scales and in different materials, but driven by the same fundamental logic. This is where the river crosses. This is where the trade flows. This is where the city will be, has been, and, in some form or another, will continue to be, because the reasons that made it a city in the first place have not go near away, and show no sign of going away. And a place that has survived 2,000 years of continuous habitation without losing the thread of what it is, has probably earned the right to be taken on its own terms, as a city that never stops becoming what it is. And so the story arrives at the present, or near enough to the present, that the distance is measured in years rather than centuries, and the city that has been the subject of all of this is still there, still on its bend in the river, still growing and changing and absorbing and renewing itself in the way that it has always done. The way that is established when the Roman surveyors drove their fee, arrest stake into the gravel terrace and set in motion a sequence of events that nobody involved in that practical decision could have anticipated would lead 2,000 years later to this. We can let the history rest now and return to where we began, to the river in the dark and the smell of mud and cold water, and a particular quality of a city that has not yet decided quite what this morning is going to be. The Thames is waiting, as it all waits, and it has something to show us before we sleep. The Thames is still there, moving through the city the way it moved through the Roman city and the Saxon settlement and the medieval port and the Victorian embankment, carrying the same tidal weight it has always carried, indifferent to the names people have given the place on its banks. What changes is everything above the waterline, and what does not change is the river. And between those two facts, the endless change and the unchanged water, the whole story of London sits. On the north bank, in the hour before dawn, a construction site is doing what construction sites do in this city, which is to say it is going down before it goes up, excavating the ground to make room for foundations that will eventually support something tall and modern and glass-fronted, and in the process of going down it is encountering, as every construction site in London encounters, the layers, the Roman timber preserved in the anaerobic conditions of the old waterfront deposits, the medieval stone from a wall or a warehouse or a church that stood here for 3 or 4 or 5 centuries before someone decided it needed to come down for something newer, the clay pipes and the Victorian brick, and the compressed detritus of a city that has been putting things in the ground and building over them and forgetting about them for so long that the archaeology of the place is measured in meters of depth rather than in years of distance. Every Londoner walks above this. Every person who crosses the city on foot, or on the underground, or on the buses that run along streets that follow routes established by medieval lanes that followed tracks, established by Roman roads that followed paths, established by the first people who needed to get from one place to another on this particular piece of ground. Every one of them is moving above the compressed accumulation of Eve. Rhine the city has ever been, without knowing it and without needing to know it. Because the past is not what cities are for. Cities are for the present, for the people in them now, for the specific and contemporary transaction between a person and a place that makes a place feel worth being in. There is a quality to old cities that younger cities do not have, and it is difficult to name precisely because it is not a visual quality or a sensory one, but something more like a weight, a density of accumulated human decision-making that expresses itself as a kind of gravity, the sense that a great deal has happened here, and that the ground is aware of it in some way that the ground of a newer place is not. London has this quality to a degree that is unusual even among old cities, because it has been continuously inhabited for so long and through so many different human eras that the accumulation is genuinely stratified, each period of the city's history laying down its own layer and then being built over by the next, creating a depth of human presence that is measurable in the archaeological record, and also somehow palpable to anyone who pays attention to the specific texture of the place. You feel it on certain streets in the old city, in the areas where the medieval street pattern has survived and the buildings are old enough and close enough together that the visual field narrows and the sense of enclosure produces something like a temporal vertigo, the feeling of being in a space that has been a space for longer than the life of any individual who has moved through it could occur, underfor. And yet the past is there. Beneath the feet of the commuter and a tourist and a schoolchild and the late shift worker making their way along the embankment in the grey hour before the sun comes up, below the pavement and the clay and the Roman tile and the Saxon bone and the medieval timber, the river is still cutting its course through the gravel and the sediment, still tidal, still indifferent, still the reason any of this exists or ever existed at all. Consider what London has absorbed. Across the 2,000 years the story has followed. Invaders and plagues and bombs and economic collapses and social upheavals and waves of immigrants speaking languages that the previous inhabitants could not understand, and bringing practices and beliefs and foods and music that seemed foreign and eventually became local and then became simply part of what London is. The way every previous foreign thing had become part of what London is, added to the mix without dissolving it, the mix keeps changing. The capacity for absorption does not. This is not a quality that can be designed into a city or legislated into existence. It emerges from the specific conditions of a place that has been for 2,000 years, the point where people and goods and ideas converge. A crossroads city, a port city, a city whose identity has always been partly constituted by the presence within it of people who came from somewhere else. The question that this story has been attempting to answer across the 2,000 years it has covered is not exactly resolved by anything the story has contained, because the question of what makes a place survive is not the kind of question that gets resolved. It gets answered, partially and provisionally, by each successive generation that looks at a ruined or emptied or devastated city and decides that it is worth rebuilding. The answer is always the same, in the sense that it is always a decision made by specific people in specific circumstances, and it is always different in the sense that the people and the circumstances are never the same twice. London survives because people have kept deciding that it should. They have decided this after fires and plagues and invasions and bombardments, and they have decided it for reasons that were sometimes practical and sometimes sentimental and sometimes simpler, habitual. The Roman surveyors did not know they were founding a city that would last 2,000 years. The Saxon merchants on the Strand foreshore did not know they were establishing the pattern that Alfred would later formalize. The builders who raised the walls of Norman London did not know that the streets they were working on would still be streets a millennium later. Nobody ever knows this. The city knows it, in the only way a city can know anything, which is by still being there. Dig down, the Roman tile is there, the medieval bone, the Saxon hearth, the Victorian sewer, all of it layered and compressed and still present in the ground, not as museum pieces but as the actual physical substrate of a city that has not stopped being a city since the decision was made to build one here, and that carries within its own geology the evidence of every transformation it has been through and every version of itself it has been. The river moves. It has always moved. The tide comes in from the estuary in the east and pushes the water upstream for hours, and then it turns and the water runs back down toward the sea. And this has been happening since before there was anything on the banks to watch it happen, and will be happening long after whatever is on the banks now has been replaced by whatever comes next. The Thames does not have opinions about this. It is not interested in the city it flows through. It flows through the city because the city is in its way, in the way that all cities are in the way of the rivers they are built beside. And the river accommodates the city the way water accommodates everything that tries to contain it, which is to say, imperfectly and temporarily and with an absolute indifference to the intentions of the people doing the containing. The mud smell is there, the cold water. The particular mineral quality of a riverbank that has been a riverbank for a very long time, that carried the same smell before the Roman surveyors arrived, and will carry it long after the current towers have been replaced by whatever the next century builds. The light is coming, somewhere to the east, above the estuary and the sea beyond it. The sky is doing what it does here at this hour, which is to begin the slow negotiation with the dark that will eventually, in its own time, produce another day. The birds are starting. 1 or 2 calls from the trees along the embankment, tentative and brief. The sound of things that have spent the night not thinking about anything in particular, and are now beginning to think about food. The river moves. The city breathes. It is still there. The wall is still there. Not all of it, but enough. Sections of Roman stone embedded in later medieval stone embedded in later still repair work. Layers of different centuries pressed together into something that looks, if you know where to find it, like a very long answer to a question nobody quite asked. You can stand beside it in the middle of a modern city and put your hand on stone that was laid when London was 3 generations old. The bridge is still there, in the sense that there has always been a bridge, though the current one is not the Roman one, or the medieval one lined with houses and heads on poles, or the Victorian one, but a later bridge built on the logic of all the previous bridges, which is that this is where you cross. The river is still there. It was there before the surveyors arrived, and it will be there when the last of the current buildings has been replaced by whatever comes next. The Thames moves through London the way time moves through everything, not caring about the names attached to it, not measuring itself against the things built on its banks, simply moving, tidal and patient and very old. London is not a monument. It is not the accumulated weight of its famous buildings or its famous dead. It is a decision that has been made continuously by millions of ordinary people who looked at a bend in a river and decided that this was the right place to be. The decision is made again every day. by everyone who arrives and stays and calls it home. That is what a city is. That is all a city has ever been. Thank you for spending this night here, moving through 2,000 years of one city's determined and improbable existence. If this kind of company is what you come here for, subscribing to the channel means the next story will be waiting whenever you are ready. There is always another city, another layer, another long and human and necessary thing worth sitting with in the dark. Sleep well.